All right. Hopefully you found that page helpful for you to understand what a void, avoidable, and an unenforceable contract is. We can talk about it more in class if you have any questions. Now let's move on into section 4, which is quasi-contracts. I don't want to spend too much time on quasi-contracts either. You can read through it because it's extremely helpful. But the only thing I want to mention about a quasi-contract is make sure to read the example in the book that talks about a doctor stopping and helping a victim of a traffic accident. That will help you understand clearly what a quasi-contract is. That if services are rendered and it appears that you would have made a contract to obtain those services, sometimes you'll have a contract that's been created. But let's move into our last section on page 200, which is interpretation of contracts. This deals with how the courts will look at a contract. When a court is looking at a contract, basically somebody is suing to have a contract enforced, saying, hey, he owes me money. I did what I was supposed to do, but he's not paying like he said he was going to do. Well, the court will look at first what they call the plain meaning rule. They will look at the plain language of the contract. What does the contract exactly say? If the contract is clear and on what they call the face of the instrument, that means is everything's clearly lined out as to what the expectations were, what the agreement was, what the consideration was, then the court will probably stop there with their interpretation. The book notes that if it's clear on the face of the instrument, they will not allow any extrinsic evidence. Now, what is extrinsic evidence? Remember, sometimes I told you that courts act in a bubble. The plain meaning rule is exactly that sort of element. When you have a bubble, the courts will just allow what's in the contract. They're not going to be concerned with outside evidence trying to pierce that contract. For example, if a contract's clear, you can't come into court and say, well, I know it's clear, but what I thought it meant was this, or we talked about something else even though I signed this contract. This isn't what I thought I was signing, even though it's clear that this is what I signed. The court will not allow outside evidence if the language of the contract is clear. A perfect example is if you go and sign a lease agreement for an apartment for, let's say, example, $700 a month. And then you are talking to the leasing agent, and the leasing agent says, hey, you know what? The rent is going to be, maybe we can see if we can lower the rent, but I'll get you to sign this contract for $700. Then maybe later on we can see if we can get it lower. Now, later on, you are coming to the leasing agent and saying, hey, how about I pay less money on the lease agreement? The agent saying, no, it's $700 a month. Well, then you go to court to sue. The court will look at that lease agreement and say, listen, we know what he said to you, but you signed a contract promising to pay $700. You pay $700 a month. We can't enforce any outside evidence. Whatever conversations you had with that leasing agent will not be allowed in. Now, that is not always the case. Sometimes courts, depending on if the language of the contract isn't clear, then sometimes the court can look at a variety of things. And I want you to turn to page 203. The book lists 8 different elements, and trust me, there are more that a court can look at when deciding, okay, what was the party's original intention? For example, let's go back to that lease agreement. If the lease agreement said the lease is $700 a month, or if the leasing agent agrees to another amount, then that amount will control or be held over the $700. Well, that creates ambiguity. It's ambiguous. And so the court can then go and see, okay, well, the contract's not clear, so let's try to find out what other evidence there is that can help us sort of decide how much rent is. An example is to find out how much all the other apartments are being rented out for. The court can look at that. If everybody else is paying $650, the court may be inclined to say, well, we know it said $700, but then there's this language here that says unless the leasing agent decides on another amount, well, that another amount is obviously probably $650 since everyone else is paying $650. So if the language of a contract is not clear, if there's some ambiguity or vagueness to the contract, the court can look to a lot of other options, and that's where a lot of contesting comes in when we're dealing with contract law. And it's one of the elements that courts will have to face, and we'll go into further discussions in the chapters ensuing later on. But just keep that in mind with other rules of interpretation, because we'll have some fun examples to work through in class. But that's it for the videos today for this week, folks. So make sure to review the chapter, and then I will see you on Monday. Thank you very much. Bye.